The airport was already crowded that morning, filled with the sounds of rolling suitcases, boarding announcements, and sleepy travelers holding cups of coffee. Among the crowd was a teenage girl, dressed simply in a light jacket, faded jeans, and sneakers that looked a little worn out. She held a small backpack close to her chest as she made her way through the security gate. Her eyes moved quickly, taking in everything around her, yet she seemed calm in her own quiet way. She didn't have much luggage, just the backpack and a small carry-on that looked almost too light to travel with. The girl's face carried a calmness, though anyone watching closely could see she was nervous. Her lips pressed together every time someone bumped into her in the line, and she nodded politely even when no one really noticed her. The flight she was about to take was a morning trip to another city. It wasn't a long flight, but it was important. She had planned it herself and wanted no one to know she was traveling. When the boarding gate opened, people rushed forward, showing their passes and moving toward the plane. The girl waited patiently, holding her boarding pass carefully so it wouldn't crumple. When it was finally her turn, she handed it over to the attendant at the gate, who scanned it and smiled faintly. "Enjoy your flight," the woman said without much thought. The girl smiled back softly, nodded, and stepped onto the jet bridge. Inside the aircraft, the air smelled of fresh coffee and the faint scent of cleaning spray. The seats were neatly arranged and soft music played in the background. A few flight attendants were busy arranging blankets, fixing headrests, and checking overhead bins. The girl walked slowly through the narrow aisle, her eyes moving over each seat number. She stopped when she reached the front section of the plane, the first-class cabin. For a moment she hesitated. She looked down at her boarding pass again, checked the number twice, then looked back at the seat in front of her. It matched perfectly. She let out a tiny breath of relief and placed her bag under the seat before sitting down. Around her, first-class passengers were already settling in. A man in a suit was typing quickly on his laptop. A woman with a pearl necklace was scrolling on her phone. Another man was already dozing off under a blanket. The girl looked out the window, trying not to draw attention to herself, but she couldn't help but notice a few stares. A couple sitting 2 rows behind her whispered quietly, glancing in her direction. She didn't blame them. Her simple clothes didn't match the polished look of most people in that section. Still, she stayed quiet, folded her hands in her lap, and kept her gaze on the clouds outside. Moments later, one of the flight attendants noticed her. She was a tall woman with a professional smile and a neat bun. She moved gracefully from row to row, offering pre-flight drinks to passengers. When her eyes landed on the teenage girl, her smile paused for a moment. She looked at her again, slightly puzzled. "Excuse me," the attendant said politely, leaning a little closer. "Are you sure you're in the right seat?" The girl blinked, unsure how to respond. "Yes," she said softly. "This is my seat." The attendant tilted her head. "Can I see your boarding pass, please?" The girl reached for her jacket pocket but froze for a moment. Her face changed slightly, a hint of worry crossing her expression. She looked up at the attendant. I think I lost it. I had it at the gate." The attendant's friendly tone faded quickly. Her eyebrows lifted in disbelief. "You lost it?" She repeated louder this time. A few nearby passengers turned their heads. "Miss, these seats are reserved for first-class ticket holders only. You can't just sit here without a boarding pass." The girl's face turned red. She swallowed hard. "I really did have it." The lady at the gate scanned it. "This is my seat." The attendant folded her arms, now clearly irritated. "We'll see about that. What's your name?" The girl quietly said her name. The attendant typed it into a small tablet she was carrying, shaking her head as she scrolled. "There's no record of you in first class," she said after a few seconds. "You'll have to move to economy." The girl bit her lip. "Please," she whispered. There must be a mistake. By now, several passengers were openly watching. A man from across the aisle leaned closer to get a better look. The woman with the pearl necklace whispered something under her breath. Someone from the back of the cabin even took out their phone, pretending to check messages but really filming the scene. The attendant's voice grew sharper. "Miss, you can't just take a first-class seat because it's empty. Please take your belongings and move back to your assigned section." The girl's hands trembled slightly as she reached for her backpack. She didn't argue, didn't raise her voice, didn't even try to explain further. She just wanted the attention to go away. But before she could stand, a man sitting in the first row glanced over his shoulder. He was older, maybe in his 50s, wearing a dark business suit. He had been quietly observing the whole situation without saying a word. His eyes followed the girl's movements carefully. There was something in her manner that caught his attention. The way she stayed calm, the quiet tone in her voice, and the way she didn't seem shocked or angry despite being humiliated. The girl kept her eyes on the floor as the attendant tapped her foot impatiently. "Come on now, people are waiting. You can't just stay here." The girl looked up, her eyes glassy but steady. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "I didn't mean to cause trouble." The attendant rolled her eyes, clearly done with the situation. "Then please move along so we can continue boarding," she said loudly enough for everyone to hear. The man in the front row frowned. Something about the attendant's tone bothered him. He opened his mouth as if to say something, but then closed it again, deciding to wait. He wanted to see how this would play out. As the girl reached for her backpack, her sleeve brushed against the armrest, revealing a thin bracelet around her wrist. The man's eyes caught the small charm hanging from it, a tiny engraved logo that looked oddly familiar. He squinted slightly, his expression changing. Meanwhile, the attendant turned toward another crew member at the front. "Can we check if she's on the economy list?" she asked impatiently. The other attendant nodded and walked toward the back of the plane to confirm. The girl stayed where she was, frozen between standing and sitting. Her hands clutched her backpack tightly against her chest. She looked out the window again, blinking fast to stop tears from falling. The sunlight hit her face just enough to show how young she really was. In that moment, the plane felt uncomfortably quiet. Even the passengers who had been whispering earlier stayed silent, pretending not to look, though everyone's attention was still on her. Minutes passed slowly until the other attendant returned, shaking her head. "No record in economy either," she said softly. "Maybe there's a system error?" The first attendant sighed, clearly frustrated. "Or maybe she just snuck in here hoping no one would notice." She turned to the girl again, her voice cold. "Miss, I'm giving you one more chance to tell me the truth. Did you take this seat without permission?" The girl opened her mouth to answer, but before she could speak, a voice came through the intercom from the cockpit. "Can the lead flight attendant please come to the cockpit?" The attendant looked surprised. "Now?" she muttered under her breath, then gave the girl a final glare before walking quickly down the aisle. The girl sank back into her seat, unsure what to do. The man in the front row leaned slightly to the side, still studying her. There was something about her that he couldn't place, but a feeling in his gut told him this wasn't what it seemed. A few rows back, passengers began to whisper again, trying to guess what was happening. Some thought the girl might be a runaway. Others assumed she was trying to get a free upgrade. But one thing was clear. The way she sat there quietly, never losing her composure, didn't fit the story the attendant seemed to believe. A few minutes later, the attendant returned from the cockpit. Her expression completely changed. Her face had lost color, her lips slightly parted in disbelief. She walked straight past the passengers, her eyes locked on the girl. The cabin grew silent as everyone waited for her next move. The girl looked up slowly, unsure what to expect. The attendant took a deep breath, then spoke in a soft voice that no one had heard from her before. "Miss," she said quietly, "please, stay seated. I'm terribly sorry for the misunderstanding." The entire first-class cabin went still. No one understood what had just happened, but the shock on the attendant's face said it all. The girl simply nodded, her voice calm as ever. "It's okay," she said softly. And as the plane doors closed and the engines began to hum, everyone around her knew. Something about this young girl wasn't ordinary at all. The teenage girl froze as the flight attendant's voice cut through the quiet hum of the cabin. It was loud, sharp, and filled with disbelief. She could feel everyone's eyes on her now, and the whispers started almost immediately. People turned in their seats, trying to see what was happening. Some passengers held their phones in their hands, pretending to scroll but secretly recording the scene. Others leaned forward, curious but hesitant, unsure if they should intervene or just watch. The girl's heart beat faster, but she remained calm on the outside. She had expected this might happen, but it still felt overwhelming to be publicly questioned in front of so many strangers. She clutched her small backpack tightly, her knuckles white, and tried to keep her voice steady. I had my boarding pass," she said softly, almost pleading. "It was scanned at the gate." The flight attendant folded her arms and raised an eyebrow, her tone sharp now. "Miss, this is first class. Every seat is reserved for a ticketed passenger. You cannot just sit here without proper authorization. Please show me your boarding pass immediately. The girl's stomach sank. She reached into her jacket pocket searching for the pass, but her hand paused. It wasn't there. She swallowed hard. I think I lost it, she said quietly, her voice trembling slightly. The attendant's face hardened. Lost it? She repeated, louder this time, her voice carrying through the cabin. You think you can just sit here without proof? This is unacceptable. Please get up and move to your assigned seat immediately. The girl bit her lip, trying not to cry. She didn't want to cause a scene, but the attention felt suffocating. She took a small step back, reaching for her backpack, and began to gather her things. The murmurs around the cabin grew louder. Passengers whispered to one another, trying to guess the situation. Some thought she was a troublemaker, sneaking into a more expensive seat. Others looked uneasy, sensing that perhaps she was just a nervous passenger caught in a misunderstanding. The flight attendant's voice continued, now almost yelling. Miss, I don't have time for games. You must leave first class this instant. The girl nodded quietly, holding back tears. She didn't argue, didn't shout, and didn't complain. She simply started to move toward the aisle, her backpack in her hands. Her calmness only seemed to frustrate the attendant more. The passengers watching whispered among themselves, some feeling embarrassed for the girl, others unsure of how to react. A man in the front row, an older gentleman with a suit and tie, leaned slightly to the side, observing the scene carefully. His brow furrowed as he watched the girl's quiet dignity contrasted with the attendant's sharp anger. There was something about her calm behavior that drew his attention, a quiet strength he hadn't expected from someone so young. He shifted in his seat, unsure if he should say something, but deciding to wait for the situation to unfold. The girl's hands trembled slightly as she adjusted her backpack. She kept her eyes forward, avoiding direct contact with anyone in the cabin. She could hear the whispers growing louder, and a few passengers were taking subtle videos on their phones. She felt exposed and vulnerable, but she refused to let anger or frustration take over. She focused on moving calmly and politely. The attendant, growing more impatient, crossed her arms and tapped her foot. I don't understand why you are resisting. Just move. This isn't optional, she said, her voice firm and commanding. The girl paused for a moment, her eyes flicking to the window beside her. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. I'm sorry, she said softly. I didn't mean to cause trouble. Her words, gentle and sincere, seemed to hang in the air. Some passengers shifted uncomfortably, realizing how harsh the scene had become. A few murmured to each other, expressing sympathy for the girl. Others looked away, embarrassed to witness the confrontation. The man in the front row leaned slightly forward, still observing. He noticed the slight tremble in the girl's hands, the careful way she avoided eye contact, and the quiet patience she displayed. There was something unusual about her, something that suggested this wasn't just an ordinary passenger dispute. He kept his eyes on her, curious to see how she would handle the situation. The flight attendant, meanwhile, grew more frustrated. She called over another crew member for support. Please assist me. This passenger refuses to follow instructions, she said. The other crew member approached, polite but cautious. Excuse me, miss, he said softly. Could you please show us your boarding pass? The girl shook her head gently. I think I lost it. It was scanned at the gate, she said quietly, her voice steady despite the growing tension. The crew member glanced at the lead attendant, unsure of what to do. The attendant's face flushed with frustration. She is lying, she exclaimed. She cannot be in first class without proof. The murmurs around the cabin grew louder. Passengers exchanged confused and sympathetic glances. Some whispered quietly about the unfairness of judging someone by appearances alone. Others speculated about why a young girl would even be in first class without her boarding pass. The girl continued to gather her things, slowly stepping toward the aisle. She didn't argue, didn't protest, and didn't raise her voice. Her quiet composure contrasted sharply with the attendant's anger, and it seemed to make the situation even more tense. As she moved, a few passengers in the front rows whispered softly among themselves. Why is she so calm? One asked. If that were me, I'd be yelling, said another. The whispers carried a mix of admiration and curiosity, as people tried to understand the young girl's unusual calmness under pressure. The man in the front row shifted in his seat again, his attention focused entirely on her. He had seen many people in stressful situations, but the way she handled herself was different. She didn't react with anger, nor did she become defensive. She simply remained calm, polite, and focused on moving through the situation without causing further conflict. The attendant, growing more frustrated by the girl's lack of reaction, raised her voice even higher. "This is your final warning. Move now or I will have to involve security." The girl stopped for a moment, her eyes glancing briefly toward the aisle. She didn't respond with anger, but there was a quiet determination in her posture. She adjusted her backpack and took another step, her movements careful and deliberate. The passengers around her watched, some feeling embarrassed for the attendant's harsh behavior. Others felt sympathy for the girl, realizing how difficult it must be to remain composed while being shouted at publicly. A few even exchanged quiet nods, acknowledging the girl's patience and poise. The man in the front row leaned slightly closer to the aisle, observing her every move. He noticed the faint bracelet on her wrist, the calm but deliberate way she carried herself, and the lack of panic in her eyes. There was something about her that suggested she was not an ordinary passenger, though he couldn't yet put his finger on it. The girl reached the aisle fully, still holding her backpack carefully. She moved slowly toward the economy section, careful not to bump into anyone or cause further disruption. Her movements were deliberate, showing respect for the space and people around her. The lead attendant followed closely, her voice softer but still tense. "Please, just move to your assigned seat," she said. The girl nodded quietly, keeping her eyes forward. "Yes, ma'am," she said politely. As she walked, the cabin gradually settled into silence again. The murmurs quieted as passengers realized the girl was complying without argument. Her calm demeanor seemed to have diffused some of the tension, even as the attendants remained flustered. By the time the girl reached the economy section, she had maintained her composure completely. She found her assigned seat, placed her backpack carefully, and sat down, fastening her seatbelt. She didn't speak further, only looked out the window briefly, allowing herself a small, quiet sigh of relief. The flight attendant returned to the first-class cabin, visibly shaken. She glanced at the remaining passengers, noticing the awkward glances and subtle nods of sympathy directed toward the girl. She felt a mix of embarrassment and reflection. Her harsh words and quick assumptions had been witnessed by many, and the girl's calm reaction had left a lasting impression. The man in the front row leaned back in his seat, his thoughts racing. He had watched the entire scene unfold and could sense that this was more than a simple passenger dispute. There was an unusual calmness and quiet strength in the girl, something that suggested there was more to her story than anyone yet understood. The cabin gradually returned to its normal rhythm. Passengers settled in, reading, working, or looking out the windows. The tension from earlier lingered in the air, but it was tempered by the girl's quiet resilience. The flight attendant moved through the first-class cabin, checking on passengers with extra care, reflecting on what had just happened and the lesson it had imparted. By the time the plane was ready for takeoff, the girl had regained a sense of peace. She remained quiet, composed, and observant, aware that the morning's events had left an impact not only on her but also on everyone around her. The whispers and judgment had faded, replaced by a subtle admiration for the way she had handled herself under public scrutiny. The plane had taken off, but the air inside still felt heavy after what had happened earlier. The teenage girl sat quietly by the window, her eyes following the soft clouds drifting by outside. Her seatbelt was fastened, and she hadn't moved much since the flight began. Around her, people whispered in low voices, trying to understand the sudden change in the flight attendant's attitude. The same attendant who had shouted at her before takeoff was now unusually silent. She walked past the girl several times, each time glancing at her with a worried expression. Her once confident steps were slower now. The passengers in first class noticed, but no one dared to ask what was going on. The man sitting in the front row kept glancing back. He couldn't shake off the uneasy feeling that something bigger was happening. He had seen the way the flight attendant's face went pale after returning from the cockpit. Something had clearly been said to her that changed everything. The girl sat still, calm and quiet, her fingers tracing small shapes on the edge of her seat. The sunlight from the window made her look peaceful, but her mind was racing. She wasn't angry. She wasn't embarrassed anymore. She just wondered how long it would take before the truth came out completely. About half an hour into the flight attendant finally approached her again. She was holding a glass of juice, her hands trembling slightly. "Would you like something to drink?" she asked softly, her voice a complete contrast to the harsh tone from earlier. The girl looked up and nodded politely. "Thank you," she said in her calm voice. The attendant placed the glass carefully on the tray table, her eyes avoiding direct contact. She hesitated for a moment, then said, I really want to apologize for what happened earlier. I shouldn't have spoken to you that way." The girl gave a small smile. "It's all right," she replied gently. "You were just doing your job." But the attendant looked more uncomfortable at those words, as if they made her feel worse. "Still," she said quietly, "it wasn't right. I should have checked more carefully before assuming anything." The girl didn't say anything after that. She took a small sip of her drink and turned back toward the window. Across the aisle, a few passengers exchanged looks. They could sense there was something unusual about this girl. First, she was yelled at. Then suddenly, the flight attendant was apologizing like her life depended on it. None of it made sense. After a few minutes, the attendant walked away quickly toward the front of the plane, where the curtain separated first class from the cockpit area. She looked nervous. She knocked lightly on the cockpit door, and after a moment, the captain's voice could be heard asking her to come in. The man in the front row leaned back, pretending to read a magazine, but his ears caught bits and pieces of their conversation. The door wasn't fully closed. Inside, the captain spoke in a calm but serious tone. "We've confirmed it," he said. "She's on the manifest under a private booking. Her name was deliberately hidden from the public list for security reasons." The attendant's eyes widened slightly. "So it's true?" The captain nodded. "Yes, and she's not just any passenger. She's someone very important to the airline." The attendant covered her mouth, realizing just how badly she had behaved before. "Oh no," she whispered. "I didn't know. I thought she was just—" "I know what you thought," the captain interrupted gently. "But that's why we should never assume anything based on appearances. She's flying to observe how the staff treats passengers without them knowing who she is. It's a kind of internal test." The attendant's face went pale again. She sat down in the small jump seat by the door, trying to steady her breathing. "I shouted at her," she said softly. "In front of everyone. I humiliated her." The captain placed a hand on her shoulder. "You'll have a chance to make things right. Just be respectful and don't make a scene. She's not the kind to hold grudges." The attendant nodded slowly, but her hands still shook. She stood up and walked out of the cockpit, closing the door gently behind her. Her mind was racing. She didn't know how to face the girl again. Meanwhile, the passengers in first class were becoming restless. Some had noticed how often the attendant was walking back and forth from the cockpit. The tension was impossible to ignore. The man in the front row finally put down his magazine and called over another flight attendant, a younger man who had been quietly serving drinks. "Excuse me?" the man said politely. "Is everything all right up front? There seems to be a lot of movement." The young attendant smiled nervously. "Everything's fine, sir. Just a small communication issue between the crew." But his voice betrayed his unease, and the man knew there was more to it. Back in her seat, the girl could feel everyone's eyes on her again. She didn't like attention, and the curiosity of the other passengers made her uncomfortable. She wished she could just disappear into the window's reflection. She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to focus on the hum of the engines, but even then she could feel the change in the air, the shift from judgment to confusion and now to cautious respect. People who had silently agreed with the flight attendant earlier were now whispering about how strange her sudden apology had been. A soft tap on her shoulder made her open her eyes. It was the same attendant again, looking nervous but determined. She bent down slightly and spoke in a low voice. "The captain would like to speak with you for a moment, if that's all right." The girl blinked, surprised but not alarmed. "Now?" she asked quietly. "Yes," the attendant said quickly. "He wanted to apologize personally." The girl nodded and unbuckled her seatbelt. As she stood, every eye in first class followed her silently. She walked down the aisle with a calm grace that seemed beyond her age. The attendant led her past the curtain and into the small area near the cockpit door. The captain stepped out, smiling warmly. He was an older man with kind eyes that carried both authority and sincerity. "Good afternoon," he said gently. "I'm so sorry for what happened earlier. You shouldn't have had to experience that." The girl smiled faintly. "It's all right, really," she said in her soft voice. "I didn't want to cause trouble." The captain shook his head. "You didn't cause any trouble. The misunderstanding was entirely ours. He hesitated for a moment, glancing at the attendant beside her, who looked like she wanted to disappear. Then he said, "I just want you to know that everyone here is grateful you're on this flight. We'll make sure you're comfortable for the rest of the journey." The girl gave a small nod, her expression gentle but thoughtful. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Please tell her it's okay. I'm not upset." The captain looked relieved while the attendant's eyes filled with tears she tried to hide. "Thank you for your understanding," she whispered. After a brief moment, the girl returned to her seat. The captain went back into the cockpit, and the attendant followed slowly, her heart pounding. She had never felt so ashamed in her career. When the girl sat down again, the man in the front row turned slightly and said softly, "You handled that with a lot of grace, young lady." She looked at him and smiled politely, though her expression held a quiet maturity that surprised him. "Sometimes," she said, "it's better to stay calm and let people show who they are." Her words stayed with him long after she said them. There was wisdom in her tone that didn't sound like it came from someone her age. As the flight continued, the tension slowly began to fade. The attendant checked on passengers quietly, offering snacks and drinks with extra care. Every time she passed the girl, she gave a small, respectful nod. By the time the plane began its descent, the whispers had stopped. The mood had softened. People could sense something important had happened, something that had changed the energy in the cabin. When the announcement came that they would be landing soon, the girl looked out the window again. The clouds had cleared and the city below looked golden in the afternoon light. She smiled to herself, relieved that the hardest part was over. The flight attendant came by one last time, stopping beside her seat. "Thank you for being kind," she said quietly. "You didn't have to be." The girl looked up, her eyes warm. "Sometimes kindness is what people need the most," she said softly. The attendant nodded slowly, unable to say anything more. She walked away with tears in her eyes, realizing how much that small moment had changed her. When the plane touched down, the passengers clapped lightly, as travelers often do. But for those who had witnessed everything that day, it wasn't just the end of a flight. It was the end of a lesson in humility, compassion, and quiet strength. The teenage girl gathered her things, thanked the staff once more, and walked off the plane calmly, leaving behind a silence that spoke louder than any apology ever could. The plane had finally landed, gliding smoothly along the runway before coming to a gentle stop at the gate. Passengers began to stir, fastening their seatbelts, gathering their bags, and preparing to disembark. The teenage girl remained calm, her hands folded in her lap, waiting until the aisle cleared a bit before she stood. Her quiet presence seemed to draw the eyes of a few passengers, who had witnessed the strange, intense events earlier. The flight attendants moved briskly, checking seats and offering help to anyone who needed it. The lead attendant, the one who had yelled at the girl earlier, approached her cautiously. Her face was pale, her lips pressed tightly together. She looked down at her hands, then slowly up at the girl. I need to apologize again," the attendant said quietly. "I had no right to treat you that way. She stopped, struggling to find words. The girl smiled faintly, her calm voice reassuring. "It's all right. I understand now that you were just doing your job." The attendant shook her head. "No, I judged you without knowing anything. I shouldn't have assumed. I feel terrible." The girl nodded slowly. "I'm not upset," she said softly. "Sometimes people make mistakes. What matters is how they make it right." The attendant's eyes glistened, and for a moment she seemed unable to speak. Then she turned toward the cockpit door. The captain had come out and was standing there with a polite, warm smile. He gestured for the girl to follow him. "Miss," he said gently, "I'd like to explain something to you, and everyone else who might be listening." The girl followed, curious but calm as the captain began to speak in front of the few passengers who remained near the front. His voice was steady and kind, yet carried a weight that made everyone stop and listen. "Earlier," he said slowly, "there was a misunderstanding involving one of our passengers here in first class. We want to set the record straight." He paused, looking at the girl. "This young lady is not just a passenger. She is the daughter of the founder and majority owner of this airline." The words seemed to hang in the air. A few passengers blinked, surprised, whispering softly to each other. The flight attendant, standing behind the girl, took a deep breath and covered her mouth with her hand. Shocked, the captain continued, She chose to fly anonymously, to observe how our staff interacts with passengers without any special treatment. The way she wanted to travel was to see what our service feels like to normal passengers. The girl's calm expression didn't change, though her eyes showed a hint of anticipation. She had known this moment would come, but she didn't want to make a scene or embarrass anyone further. The lead attendant swallowed hard, her face pale. She glanced at the captain, then at the girl. She could hardly believe what she was hearing. All the judgment, all the assumptions she had made, suddenly felt small and wrong. The man in the front row, who had been watching quietly the entire time, finally understood what had happened. He leaned slightly toward a nearby passenger and whispered, "She's the founder's daughter. That's why everything changed so quickly." The cabin was silent, but the energy had shifted. People no longer whispered with judgment. They whispered with amazement. The girl had been calm, composed, and polite the entire time, even when faced with anger and accusations. Now, knowing who she was, her behavior seemed even more remarkable. The captain smiled at the girl. "I hope you understand why this misunderstanding happened. Our staff acted based on what they saw, not knowing who you really were. But it's a lesson for all of us, too. Judging by appearances can be dangerous." The lead attendant nodded, tears forming in her eyes. She approached the girl slowly. I am so sorry for yelling at you in front of everyone. I didn't know. I judged you by how you looked." The girl placed her hand gently over the attendant's. "I know," she said softly. "And it's okay. You apologized, and that matters. I wanted to see how people treated passengers in their normal way. That's all." The attendant blinked, taking a deep breath. "I will make sure this never happens again," she whispered. "I promise to treat every passenger with respect no matter what." The captain nodded. "That's exactly the point. It's a lesson for all of us." He turned toward the remaining passengers. "We appreciate everyone's patience and understanding during this unusual situation. Thank you." The passengers nodded, some quietly clapping, not in mockery but in admiration for the young girl's composure. People whispered to each other about what they had just witnessed. A teenager, calm and kind, facing public embarrassment, and emerging with grace. After a few minutes, the captain returned to the cockpit, and the attendant went back to her duties, still visibly shaken. She moved through the cabin with extra care, checking on every passenger, making sure everyone was comfortable. Every time she passed the girl, she gave a small nod, a gesture of respect and acknowledgement. The girl sat back in her seat, looking out the window again. She could see the city below, the roads, cars, and buildings bathed in late afternoon sunlight. She felt a small sense of relief. The tension that had hung over the flight earlier was finally lifting. A few passengers approached her quietly, offering polite smiles or gentle words of admiration. One man in the aisle whispered, "You handled that situation very gracefully. I don't know how I would have stayed so calm." The girl smiled softly, looking at him with calm eyes. "Sometimes," she said, "it's better to let people show who they really are. Anger or judgment doesn't solve anything." Another woman nodded, understanding the quiet wisdom in her words. The girl's humility and kindness left an impression on everyone who witnessed it. She hadn't made a scene, hadn't demanded special treatment, and had stayed composed even under public scrutiny. As the plane continued its descent to the final airport, the girl prepared to gather her things. She packed her backpack and straightened her jacket. The lead attendant came by one last time before the plane reached the gate. "I want to thank you again," she said quietly. "You have taught me a lesson today. I will never forget it." The girl looked up at her, smiling warmly. "I'm glad. That's all I wanted." When the plane finally landed and the doors opened, passengers began to leave quietly. The teenage girl walked calmly down the aisle, her steps steady and unhurried. People who had seen the events earlier couldn't help but watch her with newfound respect. Outside the plane, ground staff and airport personnel moved quickly to guide passengers to baggage claim and exits. The girl's quiet confidence drew the attention of a few staff members, though they didn't know her identity yet. She smiled politely as she passed, giving a nod to acknowledge their presence. As she reached the terminal, she paused for a moment to look back at the plane. It had been a short flight, but the experience had been far from ordinary. She had gone in expecting to observe, but she had also ended up teaching a subtle but powerful lesson about kindness, patience, and understanding. Meanwhile, back inside the cabin, the lead attendant sat down for a brief moment. Taking a deep breath, she replayed the events in her mind, realizing how quickly assumptions could lead to mistakes. She felt humbled, yet grateful for the chance to learn from it. A few passengers lingered, talking quietly about the unusual incident. Many of them commented on the girl's composure, her ability to handle the situation with grace, and the quiet but powerful impact she had on everyone in first class. Some even admitted they had judged her unfairly earlier, and now felt ashamed of their quick assumptions. The teenage girl moved through the terminal, blending in with the crowd, still quiet but composed. Her plan had worked exactly as she had hoped. She had flown anonymously to understand the airline from the perspective of a normal passenger, and she had gained not only insights but also an opportunity to inspire change without anyone knowing in advance. By the time she reached the exit, the story of the flight had already begun to spread quietly among the passengers and staff. The lesson had been clear. Appearances can be misleading, and true character often reveals itself under pressure. The young girl had remained polite, calm, and kind throughout, teaching everyone around her a lesson they wouldn't soon forget. The lead attendant, watching the passengers leave, knew that this moment would stay with her forever. She had faced her own mistake, recognized it, and witnessed the strength of someone who had been unfairly judged but never reacted with anger. It was a lesson in humility, patience, and empathy, a lesson that would guide her in the years to come. For the girl, the day was quiet and unremarkable on the surface, but it had left a lasting impact. She had traveled anonymously, faced judgment, and returned home with the satisfaction of knowing she had seen the airline through the eyes of her passengers, and that the experience had already begun to change the way her staff would treat people in the future. And as she walked into the city, blending seamlessly with the crowd, she carried with her a quiet confidence and a sense of fulfillment. The truth had been revealed, lessons had been learned, and the flight had ended not just as a journey from one city to another, but as a story of humility, grace, and human understanding. The airport was buzzing with its usual energy as passengers moved toward baggage claim and exits. Yet among all the usual activity, there was an unmistakable undercurrent of discussion about the morning flight. People who had been on that plane were quietly sharing their thoughts, amazed at what had happened. The teenage girl walked calmly through the terminal, blending in with the crowd, her small backpack resting lightly on one shoulder. Despite all the attention she had unknowingly drawn earlier, she seemed completely at ease, focused only on reaching the exit. She paused for a moment near a coffee stand, glancing around at the busy travelers. She could hear fragments of conversations. Some were praising the flight attendant for handling the situation gracefully after learning the truth. Others were talking about the courage and composure of the young girl who had been judged unfairly. She smiled faintly to herself. It was strange to think that such a simple test, just a single flight, could create ripples of reflection and learning in so many people's minds. Back on the plane, the flight attendant who had first shouted at her sat quietly in the crew area, reviewing her own actions. She had replayed the morning over and over in her mind. How quickly she had judged the girl based on appearances, how sharply she had spoken, and how the girl had reacted with calmness instead of anger. She realized that in her years of experience, she had never faced a moment quite like this, where humility, patience, and understanding were put to the test so directly. She picked up her small notebook, where she sometimes jotted down reflections about her work. Today she wrote a single line: "Judgment without understanding can hurt more than help." She paused and read it again, letting the words sink in. The lesson was personal, but it was also professional. How she treated passengers in the future could be influenced by this one moment if she allowed it to. Meanwhile, other crew members quietly discussed the incident. Some had witnessed the girl's composure and the lead attendant's sudden shift in demeanor. Others had overheard the captain's explanation about the girl's identity. It became clear that this flight was no ordinary journey. The staff began talking about the importance of treating every passenger with respect, regardless of appearances, tickets, or assumptions. Even a few senior staff members admitted that they had sometimes made quick judgments, and the story of this flight would serve as a reminder for everyone. The teenage girl herself didn't know the full extent of the discussions she had inspired. She simply continued on her way, her expression calm, her steps deliberate. She understood that the point of her journey was not to embarrass anyone, but to see the airline through the eyes of ordinary passengers, and in doing so, she had already achieved more than she could have imagined. When she reached the baggage claim, she waited patiently, as any traveler would, blending effortlessly into the crowd. She noticed a few families watching her, curious but respectful. No one recognized her, and that was exactly how she wanted it. Observing, learning, and reflecting, without the influence of special treatment, was the whole purpose. Meanwhile, the lead flight attendant continued to reflect on what had happened. She thought about the embarrassment she had caused, the judgment she had made, and the realization that it could have been avoided. She had been angry and frustrated earlier, sure, but now she understood that her actions had consequences beyond the immediate moment. She had humiliated someone who deserved kindness and respect, and she had learned firsthand how powerful patience and humility could be. The captain, who had witnessed everything unfold, also reflected on the importance of the day. He had seen a young girl remain calm under pressure, teaching lessons without raising her voice or demanding recognition. He had observed a crew member confront her own mistakes and learn humility in a single tense exchange. In the captain's mind, this flight had become an example of how small moments can teach profound lessons about humanity. Back in the terminal, the girl finally gathered her belongings and walked out toward the parking area. She kept her pace steady, her mind calm. She didn't need applause or acknowledgement. The satisfaction of having seen the staff's natural behavior and knowing she had sparked reflection was enough. It had been a test of character, patience, and human decency, and from what she had witnessed, change had already begun. For the flight attendant, the day didn't end when the girl left the plane. She continued her duties, serving other passengers with an added layer of care and awareness. Each interaction now reminded her of the lesson she had learned, that every passenger deserves respect and kindness, no matter their appearance or the assumptions she might unconsciously make. She began to think differently about her role, realizing that empathy was as important as efficiency. As the day progressed, staff began discussing ways to incorporate this learning into training programs. They wanted to ensure that no one else would make the same mistake. Meetings were held, and even casual conversations included references to the flight and the young girl's composure. In every discussion, the message was clear. Patience, humility, and respect should be at the center of every interaction. Even passengers who had been on the flight shared their stories with friends and family. Many expressed surprise at the unexpected outcome and admiration for the teenage girl, who had remained composed under public scrutiny. A few spoke of the flight attendant, noting her eventual humility and willingness to learn. The story spread quietly, but the lesson within it resonated far beyond the cabin. The teenage girl's role had been simple in theory: observe and experience the airline from a normal passenger's perspective. But the impact of her quiet actions had been profound. Without a word of anger or complaint, she had highlighted the importance of treating people with dignity. She had reminded the staff that assumptions based on appearances could be misleading, and that true character revealed itself through actions under pressure. Later that evening, the lead flight attendant reflected on the day as she prepared to leave the airport. She thought about the young girl, about the way she had handled the situation, and about the lesson that would stay with her forever. She realized that, although the girl had been anonymous to most of the passengers, her actions had spoken louder than any words. The airline's senior staff, too, recognized the significance of what had happened. Meetings were held to review policies, emphasizing respect and fairness in every interaction with passengers. The story of the flight became an example of how even small acts of judgment can have unintended consequences, and how humility and understanding can turn those moments into opportunities for learning. Meanwhile, the teenage girl quietly returned home, her thoughts calm and reflective. She didn't need recognition or praise. What mattered to her was that the experience had sparked reflection and learning, both among the staff and the passengers. She knew that kindness, patience, and quiet composure had the power to inspire change without anyone needing to shout or make a scene. In the days that followed, the incident continued to be discussed internally at the airline. Staff shared their experiences, and many admitted that they had learned more from a single anonymous passenger than from years of training or policy manuals. The young girl had become an example of how character and humility could influence the people around her, simply by remaining calm, polite, and thoughtful. The lead flight attendant, in particular, carried the lesson forward in her daily work. She treated every passenger with renewed attention, ensuring that no one felt judged or overlooked. The memory of the girl's quiet dignity reminded her constantly that appearances were not a measure of worth and that respect and understanding were essential in her role. For the passengers who had witnessed the event, the story lingered in their minds. It became a lesson about humility, human dignity, and the quiet power of patience. They shared it with friends, family, and colleagues, emphasizing how a small act or even the way one reacts under pressure can leave a lasting impression. The teenage girl, though remained unseen and unknown to most, she had not sought attention or admiration. Her actions had been purposeful yet quiet, allowing those around her to see their own behavior clearly and reflect on it. She had proven that one person, even without power or recognition, could spark understanding and change through calmness, composure, and kindness. By the end of the week, the airline had made subtle adjustments to staff training, emphasizing empathy, patience, and attentiveness. They encouraged crew members to pause, think, and treat every passenger with dignity, regardless of first impressions. The lesson of that flight became a quiet but powerful example of how humility and respect could improve the experience for everyone. For the teenage girl, the journey had ended, but its impact continued. Her simple act of traveling anonymously had led to reflection, learning, and change among adults who were responsible for the comfort and safety of countless passengers. Her presence had reminded everyone that judging others quickly can lead to mistakes, but responding with humility and kindness can leave a lasting positive effect. And so, the story of that flight was quietly remembered, not for the shouting that began it, but for the composure, humility, and respect that ended it. The girl had flown, observed, and inspired, leaving behind a lesson that would resonate with the airline staff, passengers, and even strangers who heard the story afterward. It was a simple but profound reminder. Every interaction matters. Every assumption can be misleading, and true change comes from calm, kind, and thoughtful actions. The teenage girl's journey was not just about a flight. It was about the quiet power of empathy, patience, and understanding. Her actions, unnoticed by most, had transformed the people around her. The flight attendant had learned humility. The crew had learned patience. The passengers had learned reflection. And in the end, the airline itself had learned that true service is more than efficiency. It is about seeing, understanding, and respecting every human being who walks through its doors. As she disappeared into the crowd outside the terminal, the girl left behind more than memories. She left behind a subtle but enduring reminder of what it means to be human, to act with grace and to influence others positively without a single harsh word. And in that quiet, unseen way, she had changed everything.